Wow. Well, yeah. So Immerton is a LARP that's designed by women for women, and in the lore and in the context, everything is um, a woman's society and it's done with goddesses and other references only to women. So it's kind of like the mascara from Wonder Woman in that it's a society that has no men. Um, but it's also, because it's a game and designed, that it is actually designed only by women. So we've been very careful to have it be a project that's led by women, that the artists that we hire are women, that the people that we consult with are women. And then we're looking to have woman in all of its beautiful manifestations and embodiments and multiplicities and intersectionalities. Because the reason I wanted to do this is because gaming in general is still predominantly a male dominated industry. And there are lots of presentations more and more now about how misogyny and subtle stereotypes about women and about other um, minorities and oppressed, marginalized people are stereotyped or continue to be misrepresented, even often with the best of intentions. And so, woman can be a problematized word in that there are people who police what being a woman is. Particularly concepts of femininity and what it means to be a woman or a lady or those things. So we wanted to design something that was specifically um, up against some of those things, right? So a female identified design team, and to look at what it would be like to be in a space that is occupied only by other women.
Thanks. The trash collector is outside, so hopefully it's not too terribly loud with ambient noise while I'm speaking. So I just want to first say that I don't think Immerton is advocating for separatist spaces in the sense that we think that only women should be able to play certain things and only men, men should be excluded. It's more that the social dynamics are just different when men are around. For various reasons. I know I tend to be drawn into romance play with, male-bodied people, for example. So that changes my dynamic in the space. So it's not necessarily a negative thing. It's just that there's a different kind of dynamic that is created when you have female-identified people and without the influence of male-identified people. And so creating spaces like that is really interesting. I got to take part in Mad About the Boy in the US in 2012, which was a very interesting experiment about what would happen if the men in the world had died because of some sort of virus that affects everybody with male chromosomes. Of course, that gets tricky when you start talking about genetics and things like that. But the idea was for people who are identify as female to be able to be in a space where they're both playing out what a society would look like in those constraints. It is definitely not an utopia. there were difficulties with it. And then at the end of the LARP, this is all very transparent, the Last Man on Earth shows up. This is based on Why the Last Man comic book series. And so it's about like, how do we then navigate having this one male in this space? So having had that experience, I thought this would be a really cool project to be part of. I also have done a lot of goddess style roleplay in the vampire game that I used to run. Had a big meta plot that involved exploring different archetypes of femininity and in a sort of binary way, sort of like dark mother versus light mother kind of thing. What I really love about the design of Immerton, which we'll get into in a little while, is that we actually have 4 goddesses, and each of them have sort of what we're calling embodied versus shadow aspects. So a little bit less like negative versus positive, but like sort of dual sides of an archetype. And each of them have sort of embedded paradoxes within them. So we're hoping that it will give people lots of points of entry to be able to explore whatever they're interested in exploring within the realm of female archetypes and spirituality. You don't have to be a spiritual person to play Immerton, but archetypes and the sort of like epic goddess imagery allows us to perform in a perhaps more expressive way than we would in normal social settings. So I'm really excited for that, and I'm excited for what sort of comes out from that. You asked about playing close to home, and I would say that for me, as I was describing in this other game that I was developing, I was able to basically create my own personal mythology as a result of that. Um, and it's a mythology I still use today. I mean, some of it's sort of borrowed from Gnostic texts and things like that. But for the most part, it was developed in play, and it was developed through interacting with other people. And that has become very important to me personally. And so I think it's really cool to be able to make a space for other women to be able to experiment with those kinds of things. And I'm just super grateful to Maury for creating such a space for us. And it's also in this incredible location outside of in California, in Joshua Tree, in a house that was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, and has all these gorgeous spaces. So it's going to be a pretty, I think, transformational space as well.
Mm. It's interesting because for me, I don't try to play a character close to the heart generally. Although in this design with Immerton, we are designing for that. Sarah's played in probably a lot more of the Nordic LARPs that are designed to do that. So I'd like to hear a lot more about what she has to say. What I can speak to is the idea that even when we don't attempt to play a character close to the heart or close to home, that we are still here. Our bodies are still here. Our memories are still here. Our preferences are still here. We can be working against those as a character, but then things can happen that cause epiphanies that are about us, and they're coming through the character, but then we're relating to them um, as ourselves. And this happens with literature too, right? I mean, that's part of the power of art. I mean, that's what art does. Art wants to express something in sculpture and painting and dance, in writing, where you're transported away, but it is always related back. So that in a true experience of art, I don't want to get into what art is and what's art's not, but in this idea of when art becomes you, that's what it is. It's that there am I moment of that art has then spoken to me, has become me. And this happens with LARP in such a profound way because of the embodiment, because we're there, because our adrenaline starts pumping, because our emotions are churning. We cry in movies, that's an emotional connection too, but it's like the dynamics of dealing with it with another person. And so I can give an example of I was playing a character who was very much not like me, who was very emotionless, who was very stern, who did have a traumatic past. So there's some like me there, but had channeled it into um, a lot of physicality and a lot of repression, I guess, and was not ambitious. And in the middle of the game, suddenly was gifted this very powerful artifact and then didn't want to let go of this artifact, right? Because the artifact was like an avenue to meaning and to power. And like suddenly the character is not wanting to let go of that artifact, even though it was bad, right? It was harming her, right? suddenly was very close to home, where it was like, here I am unable to cut a tie, right, with something that is harming me. Um, this is something that has happened to me in my life, and it made sense to the character because it was about power, but it wasn't about power to Mari, right? Um, it was about the harm and about trying to make something work and about trying to uh, make the best of a situation when the right thing to do is to let it go, right? And so that can happen, um, and it is extremely powerful. And make it like I had to go back, I had to get out of game for a little while and go, why did I have such a strong reaction to that? And what did I learn about it? And I learned a lot about myself in that um, I, based on who I am, based on what I've experienced in my life, that's a thing I am still working on, right? Um, and and it came out of a situation that was analogous, but um, not. I didn't go in there attempting to play for that. If that makes sense. So, what do you think?
I do. And just to kind of clarify what that means for me is I tend to be trying to become, I don't, I'm trying not to be qualitative about it, but like a better person or take aspects of me that I want to expand upon. And then I will emphasize those. I actually, in my book, I talk about the different relationships between the player and the character. And what Maury's describing is quite a bit of distance between the way she identifies primarily and the character that she was playing. There were these points of contact, but for the most part, different coping strategies. Lately I've been playing characters of myself that are fragments or aspects that get kind of blown up. And so I guess my most recent example was I was in Just a Little Leaven, the US run, which is a LARP about the AIDS crisis, played primarily by queer people in Minnesota. We read it. And it's an extremely powerful LARP that has to deal with friendship and desire and the fear of death. And the character that I played in both runs, I've played it twice now, once in Denmark 2 years ago and once now, about a month ago, is a Tantra guru. And so I specifically played this part because she's somebody who's very similar to me in that I often find myself doing emotional care for people in the community. And that's kind of what I wanted to do in the game. I didn't, well, we call it a LARP, not a game, because the game's kind of weird in this context. But um, I wanted to not be the person crying in the corner. I wanted to be somebody who was taking care of others. And I also wanted to explore divine sexuality, which is something that I've always been very interested in. But because of my life path as an academic, I haven't really gotten to get into as much as I would like. And so playing a character that had taken a different life path that was very similar to me in so many ways, but had decided to devote her life completely to that meant that I could embody a headspace where I was a lot more advanced in a lot of ways spiritually than I am. Meditate for longer. I was able to have answers to people's questions that were coming from a place of sort of spiritual wisdom, what I would define as spiritual wisdom, rather than kind of all the different analytical complexities that I would normally add to a situation because of my academic mind. Um, and when I first played that character 2 years ago, when I had to de-roll, and this is when we're going to get into the safety stuff around around playing close to home, but sure. Let me put a bookmark and bleed though, because I don't know if this is necessarily a bleed situation. Uh, Long story short, when I had to de-roll, when I had to take off my character, there's a moment where you're your character and then you're not. And that moment may or may not be a hard shift. For some people, it's just done and they're ready to move on to the next frame. For others, it may be a slow roll. So maybe it's because those emotions come through, and that's what we call bleed out. Or if we start the game, maybe emotions from outside of the game come in. We call that bleed in. Or maybe it's just because, in my case, I had this really profound sense of panic and grief, at the idea of leaving this headspace that I had found that was so much more peaceful than my normative headspace. And so for like 3 days, I had embodied this person that was able to handle her shit, essentially, and able to be there, be very present in the moment with other people, um, and be able to I felt be competent at crisis management, things like that. And those are probably Sarah aspects that I just don't recognize in myself, but like they were blown up, they were magnified by this character. Um, so anyway, when I played her again this last time, uh, I had been doing a lot of spiritual work in the meantime because I was like, how do I find the headspace again? Is this something I can actually have in my real life? If I can be in it there, can I be in it as me, not just as this person with this very narrow frame of reference, but as me who has a much larger frame of reference? And so I was spending a lot of time doing self work around that. And when I de-rolled this time, it was like there was no change at all, which was a really cool feeling. There was definitely a change between the fictional reality and my reality, and the character and Sarah. But as far as that feeling of peacefulness that Joni has in her head, Sarah also had that. So that was an interesting shift that I noticed over, both playing the character and then coming out back into my life and then playing her again. Um, so bleed is neither good nor bad. It is just an experience. And so that's something to keep in mind. A lot of people talk about bleed in a pejorative way, like, oh, this person's experiencing bleed. There's something wrong with them. Like they can't separate the character from the player. For those of us who are interested in transformational role play, it's actually quite good to have those experiences because they can teach you really interesting things about yourself. Like Maury mentioned, like, wow, I'm having this really intense attachment to this artifact that's similar to attachments that I've had elsewhere in my life. And so this is a metaphor for exploring something about me. Um, However, it is okay if people don't want to have those kinds of transformational experiences, or if they just play because they want to have fun. I always put that in quotes because I don't always know what fun means in this context. But if they don't, if that's not their goal, that's totally fine as well. But for me, it definitely is, and it's something that I really strive towards in my play.
Gotcha. All right. So the Immerton design process is set up such that you think about yourself before you create a character. So we ask questions about yourself and about different things you may be trying to overcome or obstacles that you may have encountered or um, challenges that you have or things that you find good about yourself or things that you find difficult about yourself. We asked questions about that. Then we asked players to also identify with one of the four goddesses of Immerton and one of the seven vocations. So each character is going to have a devotion and a vocation, and these are designed to the devotions, the goddesses are designed to look at energies, but they're also designed to take representation of women outside of maiden, mother, crone, about being defined by your reproduction cycle. And so, in identifying with one of the goddesses, you just identify with an energy of reclamation, of fortification, of creation, or of destruction, which none of which are inherently positive or negative, but are aspects of humanity and aspects indeed of womanhood. And then the vocations are also designed to try to get women outside of thinking of themselves in terms of a function, right? Women are often seen as mothers, as healers, as is my thing beeping? I'm sorry. And what we wanted to do was set up different vocations that had crosses between them. So, and that were not based on whether about on physicality or on specific normally socialized roles. And so we asked the players to think about those because they're going to translate who they are to one of these new aspects. So we're wanting them close to home, with who they are, but then we're also asking them to move to this the alibi of this other society of Immerton, where things are defined differently. And that combination is how you can get a character that's not you and a character that is very much like you, right? A character that is close to home. Um, those characters are being built with that transparency, so that players know that they will be playing close to home. But in order for players to feel like they want to play close to home and experience bleed that we've been discussing, um, they are making a choice here, right, to play in a LARP that they know is designed for bleed, right? And some LARPs are, some LARPs aren't. Bleed can happen at any time, like Sarah said. But we know we're sort of, I think you used the term, Tara, in one of your articles, chasing bleed. We know that we are looking for an intentionally transformational experience by trying to feel bleed, either by, and with no shame, right? Like either if we're bringing in emotions and problems from outside of the world, we're going to bring them into the game and recognize that, but we can work to resolve them in the game so that we can then feel that sense of completion, and also not feel the guilt that we often feel of, oh, I shouldn't be bringing this thing in to the game, these feelings or these emotions. We're also looking to create powerful and emotional experiences in the game that we hope they will take outside of the game. It's really interesting to think about this in terms of game studies, because I come from a background in education, and that's just learning in education, right? I mean, in education, you can that's why we take people to plays. That's why we create certain types of lesson plans. That's why we do these things, because you go through an experience and then you have an epiphany, and that's called learning. And so that's part of what we're trying to do in this, is to learn about ourselves. But people are not willing to chase bleed or to play for what Jonea Kemper calls emancipatory bleed, which is getting rid, right, playing for something that will that through the bleed you yourself are lifted from something, are freed from something. And people are unwilling to do that sort of thing if they don't feel safe in the environment to do so, because that's incredible risk, right? It requires a lot of vulnerability on both a personal level and on a collective level, because you're sharing that vulnerability with others, which is one of the reasons why this is an all woman identified LARP, is because we can get to that space of vulnerability to think about issues for ourselves as women, um, in a different way, right, with by peeling off the layer of patriarchy and peeling off the layer of having to perform in front of um, of men and non woman identified folks. So things we had to set up were one of the things we have is called a goddess chamber, which is essentially a black box. The black box is a thing that's used in a lot of LARPs, where you can go inside of a separate chamber, a separate room, or separate area, um, using light and sound, and get into a more intimate experience, to play out something that's very personal, or with only a few people. So that's a safer space because you won't have to be around everyone else. Um, and also, people can opt in and opt out of that, because what if I want to play out something that has to do with a theme that's important to me or my character, that would be traumatic for others to experience? So, such as, for example, sexual assault. Um, so by calling it the goddess chamber, it becomes a space of devotion and intervention, and also identification with aspects. So players can choose those aspects: fortification, strengthening, right? Reclamation, reclaiming something; destroying or cutting, right? The ties, and Inara, creation, right? And so, which of those do I need at the moment to explore this thing? And so it's not just a random room, if that makes sense. Whereas the black box can sometimes be a random room, or in other LARPs, it's often a ceremony of death, is done in the black box. But it's making a choice and going into this room, and then being facilitated through that experience with one of the designers here, who will be either embodying the goddess or facilitating the experience using designed tools that take into account that uh, moving through that journey. So I've talked a lot. So I'll stop there with that one example and let the conversation continue.
So for those of you who can't hear Tara, she asked, we just found out that her microphone isn't working for some reason. She asked about emotional safety, and for those of us who are trying to have those kinds of experiences, how do we establish emotional safety? And I think there's an awesome article by Charles Ken Peterson that talks about safety. A LARP is only as good as its safety culture, meaning that you can have all sorts of safety tools in your LARP, but if the culture around it does not support those tools, they're kind of useless. So we spend a lot of time, Maury and I, and Johanna Koljonen and others, sort of like um, coming up with different ways to for people to check in, for people to opt out, for people to opt in, for people to create consent or establish consent with each other in very specific ways. Um, but if those tools aren't being used or they're not being supported by the game culture, then it's very difficult to create a feeling of safety. So one of the things that Maury has said in the past that I really loved is that safety, and I'm probably going to mangle this, but basically safety is very personal. It is something that every individual feels at every individual moment. So it's not just like, and now we have safety. Great, we have the safety stamp of approval, and we can just move on. It's conditional on that person's individual safety, and what may feel safe for one person may not feel safe for another. So that's just important to keep in mind as we move ahead. It doesn't mean it's impossible. It just means that we it's a process. It's a process of creating comfort between people. It's about giving people permission to state their out of game needs to each other and have that not be stigmatized. There are a lot of LARP cultures for which it has been taboo to talk about your feelings. And it doesn't mean that people in the community don't care about each other. It means that it is not. It was not socially acceptable in a lot of cases to be able to self-advocate when you are having an emotional difficulty with something. Oftentimes, the game itself and the fiction of the game would take priority over individual feelings of players. And there's times when that might be appropriate. There may be times when a person isn't a good fit for a LARP. And that's another sort of ongoing discussion that we're having is like, how much accommodation is too much and how much is appropriate. And it's sort of the individual versus the collective. It's this sort of tension of what makes a good group experience for everyone versus one person. A lot of what we're trying to do is not so much completely change the LARP itself, although that's certainly Immerton is designed with safety in mind, but to create safety nets to be able to catch people if they are not in a good space. So we've been developing this LARP counselor role, which you can read about on nordiclarp.org, where there's literally people on staff, on the safety staff, that their job in game and out of game is to try to catch people if they're having emotional difficulties and help them process through it. And if necessary, transition them out of game, although it's preferable to try to resolve it in game if possible. And that's also important for dealing with issues of any sort of issues of harassment that might come up. They're pretty rare. It's not like we're saying that it's a constant, but they do happen. Um, and so they're kind of were like LARP first responders in a way, emotional responders. Um, and then there's also things like the OK check-in, which has been adopted in the last year since it was sort of piloted in its current form at Neuromagiscola. It's been adopted by, from what I hear anecdotally, Nero, Mind's Eye Society, many different LARPs and Dystopia Rising. And that's a really encouraging thing, because what it means is that a tool has been established that is intuitive, it's easy to use, it's not terribly intrusive, although some people do feel it like it intrudes on their immersion. But it's not as intrusive as trying to have a conversation with somebody about, are you okay? Um, And it is something that a lot of people see an immediate use for because, say, I'm yelling at someone in character, which I try very hard not to do. But let's say that I am. I can check in with them and see if they're okay. And if they want that kind of play, they can do this. If they really want that kind of play, they can do this. If they're kind of not sure, if they're not okay, then I can stop what I'm doing or dial it back. And I can have a conversation with them. Another one that Johanna Koljonen developed is called the Look Down. And that one has been extremely effective as well, as we've been implementing it in these different LARPs. That allows people to just leave a scene for any reason, and everybody knows what this means, and there's no conversation needed. Now, one thing that Johanna would say is she's very wary about just adding random safety tools to any LARP. Like she thinks that LARPs should be designed intentionally for the purpose that they're trying to serve. So there may be LARPs where people don't want to have those safety tools because they're trying to push for a certain type of play. My personal opinion is that that's fine as long as everyone who's signing up is on board for that style of play. I would prefer for LARPs that have open signups, where you have people from lots of different backgrounds that don't necessarily have the same play style, to be able to have these tools, to be able, or similar tools, whatever you decide to create, to be able to make sure everybody's on the same page in terms of play. We call this calibration. Um, and similarly, we've been creating these consent mechanics. Mechanics is kind of a weird word, but consent negotiation scripts for how to ask for consent in a way that doesn't end up feeling coercive. People are unlikely to want to coerce someone else, but sometimes they can accidentally do so by their body language or by the way that they're asking a question. Like maybe they're really excited, like, I really would like to do this thing. It's like, that feels really pressury. I'm going to let that happen, even though they were technically asking for consent. It doesn't always feel that way. So trying to develop really a language around something that a lot of us have never learned how to do in real life, which is have those kinds of frank conversations about what we like and what we don't like and being very specific, has been a challenge. It's a little bit clunky and we're trying to figure it out as we go along. But more importantly, I think, than having the words be exactly right, although the words are phrased the way that they are for a reason, is creating that safety culture that we talked about, creating a culture in which we are asking for consent before we do things, rather than just saying the game rules say that I can do this thing, so therefore I can do it. I have a certain amount of points in this thing, and therefore I can do whatever I want in this setting because that's the way the game rules work. Instead, taking a step back and saying, well, yeah, I could do that thing, but how would you feel about it? You know, and then when you get that buy-in from the other player, often they're totally down for that thing, but they needed to feel safe. They needed to feel like they could trust you, and asking that question sometimes can help them do that. So I think the goal here is not so much the tools themselves, although those help, but creating the culture around the tools where people take care of each other.
Good. Immerton is, excuse me, Immerton is a fairly small LARP. So we're going to have 20 people or less here. And so some of these tools are really important when you have a larger LARP like New World Magiscola or Enlightenment and Blood, or these areas, because you have people who don't get a chance to know each other more personally in the workshops before the game or over large expanses. So since Immerton is fairly small and personal, some of the tools may be a little less necessary in the sense that we can accomplish the same thing in other ways. But to start with, before we go into the game, we have a half day of workshops that are out of character and helping build us into character. And during those workshops, we are establishing trust and establishing relationship and letting people feel safe to be vulnerable, letting people feel safe to tell us about themselves and what they are interested in playing, beginning to establish that culture of care that Sarah was talking about, and the ability to trust each other for the kind of vulnerable role play that we're expecting. The tools we'll teach them in the workshop, they are intuitive. Um, there have been a lot of LARPs that have tried to implement certain hand signals so that you don't break immersion to use the hand signals. And sometimes you can end up with too many hand signals, or hand signals that are like I don't know, the things that happen in baseball where they start doing these things that mean different things to from the pitcher to the catcher, and you have to remember what the symbols are. And those can be difficult for new players, and they can be difficult for people to remember when they are feeling stress or even under the cognitive load of role play itself. So the look down is simply, it's shielding your eyes, and that's allows you to enter or exit a situation um, without explanation, because sometimes we won't make the choice to calibrate our uh, a scenario or scene that we're in because we feel guilty or because we don't know how to get out of it. And if you have a tool that you can use that allows you to just need to take care of a need, a personal need that can be as boring as I have to go to the bathroom and I don't want to say it to everybody, um, or as big as I'm feeling emotionally overwhelmed and I need to go speak to a counselor, and just be able to put your hand up and have people let you gracefully exit without having to justify or explain, is a very powerful tool. And I wish I had it in real life. I wish I could just be somewhere and not have to try to do that. I'm in a meeting and I need to just, I'll be back or whatever. I just need to, go. And it's also really simple and really intuitive. We tried to do that with OK Check In as well. Asking, okay, it's done in scuba, it's done, but we also made it a question. So I can just very easily, if I see that you're frowning or that you are looking upset or that you're looking bored or looking lost or any of these sorts of things, that I can just ask you, okay? And then you can tell me, I'm fine, I'm not okay, I'm not sure, and I'm definitely not okay. And by giving them a set of tools like that, it first of all emphasizes that we've thought about it, number one, right? That we know that sometimes you have needs, personal needs, and that it can be you can feel a lot of social pressure to deny those needs, because you're afraid of breaking the game, or you're afraid of looking bad in front of your peers, or any of these other things. And so, by giving them the tools to do that, it empowers them to be who they are, to recognize their choices, their wants, their desires, their triggers, their trauma, their bodily needs, their stamina, their all those things, so that they can be real and be brought in and be recognized, and that they have a tool to use that we will all agree on to allow them to make choices, and that becomes very empowering. So because they're fairly intuitive, they're not strange symbols. They tend to be learned pretty easily, and because we set them up, we both talk about them beforehand, we teach them and model them in the workshops, we have an expectation that they'll be used. We have people in the game who are experienced players who will be modeling them and using them. They begin to catch on because the community supports them. Where, like Sarah was saying, where it can be an issue is where it's overlaid on top of a culture that isn't that doesn't support that. So for example, if you had a culture where if I do the look down to leave and somebody says you're just trying to avoid consequences for your character, pretty soon nobody's going to do the look down to leave, because the social community is actually pushing back against you for not for why you did that and why you need to do that, when it should be just accepted and used. Sure, I think the goddess chamber is part of one of several layers, because we were first transparency of expectations is important from the front, and so it states on Immerton that sexual assault, for example, will not be a part of the game. You're not going to encounter it in the game, um, because we should know as players the kinds of things that we might encounter, so that we can make choices. However, it states that that doesn't mean you can't ever role play on that. It just means that you need to role play on it in a way that's safe for other people for whom that is not something they wish to replay or encounter. And so the goddess chamber, being a separate space, is a place that they can opt into And you can also then change your mind. So I may have come into the game saying, yeah, I did not want to explore or see anything about sexual assault, for example. And then in the course of the game, I'm feeling safe and I'm feeling um, some things come up and I'm feeling like maybe I do want to explore it, right? And so I can change my mind now and then I can choose to go into the Goddess Chamber as a place to explore it. So we haven't decided exactly which uh, symbol or mechanic that we'll use to invite people into the Goddess Chamber, but we're playing around with something similar to what they use at Just a Little Lovin', which is a feather, um, so that it's a way of stating that you and I'd like you both of us to go into the Goddess Chamber. Consensually to play out the scene that maybe is a memory, maybe it's from my past, maybe it's exploring an alternative future, um, maybe it's looking at a topic, and of course you can go into the Goddess Chamber yourself. But the idea is the opt in and opt out um, is really the umbrella term that the Goddess Chamber is sort of part of, and so the philosophy isn't that, well, you're here, you're in the game, whatever happens happens, and you decided to join the game. And in some games, game masters are there to shock and surprise and ambush, or even betray your character, and that's actually part of the fun of that game for the people who are there. Although a lot of times people don't have fun with that because they get very invested in a character or a situation, and then something that's completely outside of your control comes in and forces you to do something, including kill your character. And so I don't like to design games like that. Immerton has definitely not like that, um, because that isn't fully consensual to me, because consent can change over the course of the LARP, and I maybe don't want to be ambushed at 2 a.m. And so opting in means I can say enthusiastically, yes, this is what I want to go in and do. So I can go into the Goddess Chamber, or I can go out to the desert with this group of people. And this is a choice that I'm making for my character and for myself. Um, and opting in means that I have an idea of what I'm opting into, right? And it means that I've made a calculation of, yeah, this is something that I want, and yes, this is something I think I can do. Um, and I maybe decide to push myself, um, and I maybe decide that I'm feeling comfortable and I don't want to push myself, but I'm not forced to. I'm opting in. Opting out then is the opposite side, which is something happens and I'm not comfortable with it, and I decide, and that's part of what the look down is for, is that now I want to leave it. I'm opting out. I don't want to participate in a scene that has to do with sexual assault. I don't want to walk to the desert. I don't want to do, right? And so the thing about it is, this is dynamic, right? And this is what we often don't think about when we start talking about game design. It's just because I opted in 30 minutes ago doesn't mean that now that I can't now suddenly want to opt out, because things have changed. My energy level may have changed. My emotional level may have changed. The weather may have changed. Things have changed. And now I no longer want to be here. And so if I choose to not be there for any variety of reason, I need to have a mechanic to allow me to opt out so that I can uh, readjust, recalibrate, get the experience that I want. And that's a big change in control from game design. Has sometimes been that a game designer makes something and gives it to the people. It's kind of like the educational model of the teacher filling the pail or filling the bucket, right? So here's the game designer. Here's my game. I'm giving it to you. I just made like bear claws. But uh, in this design, the game designers have given us a space, and you make choices among the space, and those choices are personal to you or to the group of people that decide to do it together. And we don't privilege one choice over another, um, because it's a personal journey. Does that answer the question? I hope.
Yeah, the issue of trauma is really sensitive when it comes to LARP. I personally have explored a lot of trauma through characters. Um, And recently, even in some summer things that we ran, and the experience left me. And I was consciously exploring this, I should say. It wasn't like it was surprise trauma. It was stuff that was like, okay, I'm going to make sure that everybody involved in this um, is consenting and that we're opting into this experience and yada yada yada. It can be very sensitive in that even when you are exploring it in a somewhat contained space like a black box, it can still spill over into the rest of the game. And so I'm actually been writing a lot about or thinking a lot about uh, what I'm calling the LARP domino effect, which is when a certain type of content that's explored, it could be trauma related, it could be just really intense for whatever reason, starts to spill over and sort of take over the rest of the LARP. Even when it is in a contained space, even when people have made great pains to try to keep it that way. Um, and so, one thing to think about in terms of group dynamics is when you are bringing in trauma, who is your support network? And that support network optimally are other players that are also on board with playing with that content with you. But also in terms of game design, who is the support network that can potentially help if someone is not capable of continuing play or having a lot of difficulties continuing play because they have been playing with difficult content, or more than likely, often it's because trauma has intruded. And Maury wrote a wonderful article on triggers in LARP and how trauma intrusions can occur. Um, in a LARP where it was a very, for the most part, light and fluffy artistic LARP, but somebody kept making a loud noise, and it wasn't that person's fault. It was just something that they were doing for a dramatic effect, and I had to ask them to not make that noise because it was literally breaking me out of play with a trauma trigger. And it's not their fault at all. It's just the way my brain works. But the fact that I was able to ask that, and that ask was honored by my co-players means a lot to me as a player, because I often in that mode will start to feel like I am a bad player, like there's something really fundamentally wrong with me that I shouldn't be role playing. I've literally been told by people that I just shouldn't role play if I have trauma triggers. And there may be people for whom that is their belief, and that's fine. But I am of the belief that we should try to make LARP more accessible to more people. And a lot of us have had very difficult experiences, and a lot of us use play as a way to try to make sense of those experiences. It is, however, not psychodrama. It is not being facilitated by a licensed therapist. And when we say we have LARP counselors, we actually are putting that term in quotes. Oftentimes, we do not have licensed psychologists. We have people who are willing to do emotional labor, basically, who may or may not have training in that. We're hoping to do more professional development around that and have more people with a psychology or counseling background in those roles, but it's not always possible, right? So it's important to realize that if you are playing with that, similarly to if you're playing a romance with somebody or any other content that's very personal, there is the potential to have very intense emotional reactions that may be difficult to control, um, and that's okay. Like the culture that we're trying to create says that's okay. There's nothing wrong with you for having those reactions, but there is a level of personal responsibility involved there, right? So if I know that I'm particularly playing with a certain trauma, then I need to be mindful that the other people around me have opted into helping out with that. And that may involve a discussion ahead of time. So, for example, I was in a game this weekend where it's actually a really kind of sweet game. It's called Tension by Alex Roberts, where it's sweet is maybe not the word, but it's about sexual tension, and you pull you're role playing out this relationship that probably shouldn't happen, but their sexual tension keeps building, and you're pulling Jenga blocks out for each move that the people make, base that escalates that tension. But it's so similar to my personal life right now that like I had to disclose that ahead of time, right? I had to say, look, this is going to actually be probably pretty bleedy for me. And I hope, and ask my co player if that was okay with them. And so sometimes it just is about getting other people on board and explaining, what your triggers are or what your sensitivities are, and asking them if they're okay with playing with that. And if they're not, that's totally cool. But having, surprise, I'm processing my trauma and everyone now has to deal with it, I find that to be a little bit problematic. And sometimes it just happens. Sometimes players just have content that comes up. It's certainly happened to me before. It's happened at New World Magiscola, and it often happens when we are at our emotionally most worn down. So, like if we haven't had enough sleep, or I'm just happen to be in a very loud room, and a lot of people are asking me for a lot of things that I don't feel like I can do, and then I start crying uncontrollably, and I was able to process that in game because of the culture of care that Magiscola has. A lot of my in-game friends were able to help me actually process that as my character rather than me, which was great because I was able to get back into play fairly easily. But that's not always possible. So, when dealing with trauma, or even just emotionally charged situations, trauma is always is kind of a very specific term. I think it's really transparency, like Maury was saying, is very important. Making sure that it is contained. So if I were to play a sexual assault in the black box at Immerton, for example, I maybe wouldn't want to talk about that outside of the black box. The problem with that, though, is that if it's a central part to my character's experience as a woman, it may feel like erasure if I can't talk about it, because that's how often it is in real life, right? Like we can't talk about those kinds of traumatic experiences because society wants us to pretend they never happened. So that gets tricky. But if it's in the design of the LARP that you will not have to integrate and interact with this content unless you absolutely want to, then that needs to be honored. But we had this discussion in designing the race for Just a Little 11 because we did want to allow people to play their intersectional identities. And Kat Jones did a wonderful job of creating a document around that. But the question being, if I play out a hate crime in the black box, do I get to then talk about that hate crime outside? Because then that content is now domino effect, right? Is now outside in the LARP space, and then the LARP now could become about that thing. So we were able to. Uh, we didn't want to erase it, so we decided to allow that content to be out, but people to remind people that they could look down and they could exit any scene for any reason. So there are ways to calibrate around, like if you don't want to interact with traumatic content. Um, so it's difficult, in other words.
I am really looking forward to being in a group of women. Um, and to, I had three brothers. I have very often not been in um, social spaces that were all women, and a lot of times women's social spaces are commodified. They're around things like um, pampered chef parties, or um, those the candle parties, or some of the other spaces where we're actually supporting other women by buying stuff um, from them. And I know, but it's true if you start to analyze it. Um, there, the makeup parties and the clothing parties and those things. And so I'm very much looking forward to being outside of those layers and imagining and creating with and exploring, because one of the things that we share as women and women identified people are is a sense of very different, but also we've all had some sense of oppression from outside society. Each of our experiences is different, but they are all similar in a way of we have been told by someone that we were not pretty enough, not strong enough, not ladylike enough, too masculine. We've been catcalled. We've been these various sorts of things, and to shed that, and also to be open to uh, experiencing a society where that doesn't exist, and then also, but also being open to recognizing that the characters in Immerton come from outside, right? They come from a world where that does exist. And Immerton is a sanctuary for them and an empowering place. So it's designed on purpose for that sort of, this is the things that we have on the outside, let's play with it some on the inside by creating that story. And so I'm really looking forward to exploring that with um, a lot of wonderful, multiplicitous women who, on the full moon in the desert, where we can really get outside of regular society, and really feel immersed in this area. Um, that was the question, right? Was what am I most looking forward to? Um, yeah, and creating. There's a lot of obviously we'll be creating a world together, and we'll be creating stories together because it's a LARP. But the part of what we're doing in the LARP through ritual, and through the healing is offerings of creative, physical creative things, with sculpting and dance and music and those sorts of things. So yes, that.
Mhm. So for me, the kind of play that I most enjoy is metaphysical, philosophical play, exploration of um, facets of the self that are what we call in depth psychology transpersonal, meaning that you have your ego, which is your sense of identity, but then you also have some sort of larger connection to something bigger than yourself. And that's called the transpersonal. And that can be identified in various ways. It could be just an archetype, like a particular symbol that you feel connected to. And that archetype may or may not just be a psychological thing, or it may be connecting to something bigger. I mean, Carl Jung definitely thought that we were all connected in terms of these like archetypes in this collective unconscious. Um, but you know, it doesn't have to be that. You don't have to believe that you are actually interfacing with goddesses, or that you're actually tapping into something bigger than yourself. But when thinking about this term of bleed, particularly emancipatory bleed, which the way Janaya Kemper is describing it is really in terms of marginalized identities, and certainly being a woman is one. Um, this notion that we can somehow be more than we are, whatever that means for each individual person, I think is super productive. And so, what I'm really looking forward to is seeing women exploring what that means for them. Um, talking about maybe, spiritual beliefs that they don't normally get to talk about, or getting to embody aspects of themselves that they don't normally feel empowered to embody. And maybe engaging in ecstatic dance, or some sort of like ritual dance with weapons, which we've been discussing, that can feel very liberating and empowering for the body, without it being a performance or a spectator sport, or something that they're doing for the benefit of, let's face it, men, or other women, certainly, or people who identify differently. But oftentimes the female body historically has been a site for male fetishism, so that won't be part of this space, right? And so that's a really interesting thing. That will be it'll be interesting to see how people respond to that. um, and don't get me wrong, I actually have absolutely no problem with fetishism as long as it's optional. Like, as long as somebody is making themselves into a fetish object, like a burlesque dancer, and they, are creating an art form out of it, good for them. Or if they're, I don't have any problem with people wearing makeup or wanting to aesthetically alter themselves in order to be appreciated by others. Um, what we're describing here, though, is a difference between a performativity that is there for the benefit of others, and something that is a personal expression. And so I think what I'm most interested in is the degree to which people will personally express in ways that they don't normally get to in the outside world, and what sort of potential transformation that can occur. Some people may go to this LARP and not feel anything transformative at all, and that's totally fine too. As long, I mean, everybody's experience is valid. So setting up this expectation that I'm going to have this transformative experience will sometimes lead to sadness, right? Like it's like it wasn't what I hoped it would be. But at the very least, experimenting and exploring what different spaces can feel like, what a LARP can be. You know, in this LARP, I'm going to go and create a sculpture for an hour, and that's going to be part of my process, as opposed to going and fighting a monster. Either of those things are valid in a LARP space, but we're sort of stretching what people's expectations of LARP can be. That's going to be interesting to see how people respond to that. Thank you so much for having
It's
us.
a really productive discussion. Yeah.
Yeah,
Thanks. You
you
too.
too.